My name's Andrew Fife, and I'm here to talk to you about the ethics of international sanctions. What I want to start off with is just a little bit of history, and in particular, let's talk about empire. So, for a long period of human history, the world was divided up between empires. The British Empire made sure that it had colonies which could supply whatever resources it needed. The French Empire made sure it had all colonies that could supply all the resources it needed. That way, if you went to war with one of your competitors, you couldn't be cut off from what you needed. How important are resources? Well, I mean, Germany largely lost World War I and then also World War II because they didn't have access to, among other things, oil. Germany famously invaded Russia in World War II, partially because Hitler was a racist asshole. And I mean, part of his motivation was to try creating an empire which was self-sufficient so that Germany had everything it needed, and it wanted Russia for the farmland so that Germany could supply its own food resources. One of the stupid things that Hitler did was that he wanted to kill everybody because he was an incredible racist in Russia and replace them with Germans, which just led to the Russians fighting to the death because they were fighting for their lives because Hitler was not there to conquer them and rule them, but to genocide them. But also, he invaded Russia when he did. He couldn't have delayed it any longer because he was running out of oil. And he was going to lose the war unless he got the oil in the Caucasus. So, in any case, for a long time, finding a way to have rulership over an area where you were self-sufficient was an incredibly important task of any sort of dominant power, and clearly going to war to ensure that you were self-sufficient and not dependent on some other empire was an important thing that you would do. And sanctions wouldn't really work because it's not like the other major powers depended on you, right? They were a part of some other grouping of empire which traded within itself. So it's not like you could engage in sanction warfare up until after World War II. So after World War II, this empire stuff kind of ended. There was no one left standing except for the last two major powers, the US and the Soviet Union. France was devastated, Germany was devastated, the UK was devastated, right? There was only two major powers that were left with any sort of strength and economic power. And so for the next 50 years, we had the Cold War. And there were two communities to join. There was the free world with the US and Europe and France, and then the Soviet Union. Again, sanctions didn't work all that well because you had two major powers, and if the US sanctioned you, like Cuba, you could cozy up to the Soviet Union. And so you couldn't sanction a government at this time because just like in previous periods where there's a lot of different empires, here where there were two, and you could just move to the other one if one of them sanctioned you. But all of this ended with the Soviet Union collapse in 1989. So in 1989, we're left with just the free world, right? Just the US, just the capitalist US free market, democratic, westernized, etc. And now there was just one world, one economy, one global market, and the U.S. patrolling the oceans and enforcing, making sure that everybody, was not a part of the Soviet Union, which didn't exist anymore, but still enforcing the, I think, great world structure that came out of, free world structure that came out of the end of World War II. And so now sanctions were possible. Like a real powerful tool. And they've exploded. As a supposedly more humane way to shape the world and topple dictators and police bad actors and enforce the world structure instead of violent wars. This only became possible because now the US or the Western world or the UN can sanction a government and they don't have other options. And this is a very new experience in human history. The, I think, best example to talk about here, the biggest example, is Iraq, which is a little bit complicated. Let me just go through the history here. So in 1990, Iraq invades its neighbor Kuwait. Now, Iraq had been fighting with Iran for 8 years, and there was 2 years of peace. And then Iraq decided to invade Kuwait, which is a very small country on its border, to take its oil and take its ports. Saddam at the time had the world's 4th biggest army. And George Bush and the U.S. at the time decided to attack, to bring together through the UN an absolutely enormous force to kick Saddam out of Kuwait. Among other things, to defend Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia was worried that they were going to be next when Iraq invaded Kuwait. So we liberated Kuwait and kicked Saddam's army out of Kuwait. The ground war only lasted 100 hours because the force was so large. And after the war, I mean, at some point during the invasion, the U.S. Army is pushing up into Iraq, getting closer and closer to Baghdad, and George Bush calls the war off. He says, okay, fine, leave Saddam in power. Now, he had a couple options here. One was he could have kicked Saddam out and then tried to replace Saddam's government there. He decided that would be messy, terrible, much more complicated. The other option was to make peace. Say, okay, Saddam, we kicked you out of Kuwait. We want some concessions. We'll have peace, and then we'll reestablish normal relations with your country. Normally, when a war ends with your enemy, in the past, you made peace and you maybe forced concessions, and then you treated them like normal. You went on like they were another part of the community. But George Bush decided to go with this brand new third option, which is available to him because of the collapse of the Soviet Union and the fact that the U.S. and the Western powers were the only major force in the world, which was sanctions. He thought to himself, you know what? We don't have to topple Saddam. What would be a much more peaceful, much more internally generated overthrow of Saddam? Let's just put some no-fly zones in the north and the south, and we'll put a ton of sanctions on Iraq. And then his power will collapse on its own. We don't have to overthrow him. We'll just put sanctions on this country. Doesn't involve a war, doesn't involve us occupying a country, doesn't involve us rebuilding it. Let's do that instead, and then his own people will get upset with him and overthrow him and then replace him with something else. So sanctions partially explain why George Bush didn't go all the way to Baghdad in 1991 and overthrow Saddam, because he thought he had this third option. So then, we have between 1991 and 2003, we have this intensive sanction regime, which UNICEF estimates killed up to 500,000 children under the age of 5, probably millions of civilians, right? These are comprehensive sanctions that deprive the country of food, economic benefit, medicine, all sorts of different technology, and closed them off from the rest of the world, which devastated the country, left the military in a terrible state, and really weakened the Saddam regime. But he was able to stay in power. The painful thing about all of this is that, in Korea, in Cuba, in Iraq, you learn that countries can get by without a lot of money because there's still enough money for the leaders to be rich and have everything they want. And they can just let their citizens starve, which seems to be what happened. So in 2003, after 9/11, after the attack on the World Trade Centers and the Pentagon in the U.S., and after George W. Bush, so George Bush's son, is now president and has fought in Afghanistan and thought he won, decides that he also wants to invade and finish the job in Iraq. Saddam's a bad guy. He's genocided his citizens. He's invaded his neighbors. We thought sanctions would get rid of him, but they haven't. It's been 10 years. We need to go in and actually overthrow him. Also, we need a big win after 9/11, right? Let's go remake all of these countries and fix the world, and not just leave it to sanctions, and let's show our strength. So George Bush Jr. Invades Iraq again in 2003 to finish the job after sanctions have failed. And we've seen the terrible consequences of overthrowing Saddam, right? That was 18 years of anarchy and violence and civil war and occupying a country with less than 6,000, but over 5,000 U.S. deaths. I don't know what actually it came out to be. I fought there myself. I was there for the invasion. Many of the children I met there are now dead. ISIS, the creation of ISIS. We see why George Bush Sr., the father, didn't want to overthrow Saddam and try to rebuild the country, occupy and rebuild the country, because he saw how much of a mess it would be. George W. Bush did not think it was going to be a mess. He thought it would be easy. So you might think, seeing how terrible it was to overthrow Saddam and how terrible it was to try getting rid of this bad actor, it would have been, maybe this proves that George Bush Sr. was correct to just stick to sanctions. Sanctions were great. We can maybe get rid of Saddam without all the terribleness of what George W. Bush brought by invading Iraq and giving up on sanctions. Sanctions didn't work for 10 years, and it killed a lot of Iraqi civilians. So, looking at history, it's a short history. I think it's a little hard to tell how we should judge sanctions. But it's not clear. Sanctions ended up killing a lot of Iraqis over the years after George Bush Sr. enforced them. And of course, George W. Bush's alternative solution, which was just to overthrow Saddam, was also terrible and also killed a lot of Iraqis. So it's kind of bad options on both sides. But let's talk about the possibility that the problem is, or at least maybe part of the problem, is that the world is just so new at this form of warfare, sanctions, international sanctions. Again, it's only really been possible since the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1989. And sanctions have evolved a lot over the last 30 years. Okay, Iraq in the 90s, total mistake. We did it wrong. These comprehensive sanctions, but now they've become more targeted, more precise, maybe not so much of a blunt instrument. In the most recent Russian-Ukraine war, sanctions have been focused on weapons, crucial technology, and against individuals and high officials. And it's not clear that ordinary Russians are seeing too many of the consequences of these sanctions on their country. And yet it still is debilitating Russia's ability to fight the war in Ukraine. So just to list a couple things from the sanctions that have been levied on Russia due to the Ukraine war that's currently ongoing. The Central Bank of Russia had half of its foreign currency stored, banked, kept in foreign banks, and those have all been frozen. So over 4,000 in foreign exchange reserves have been frozen abroad. Western governments have instituted export controls, restricting Russia's access to high-tech components, both hardware and software made with any parts of intellectual property with Western governments. And also, if you sell Russia, the Russian government, a bunch of copies of Windows or microprocessors they might use in weapons, you're going to get arrested. So it's not just that Russia can't import them, but also no one that we deal with is able to sell them to them, and we might arrest you if you do. Western governments have also punished Russian officials by banning their travel, their use of the banking system, as well as freezing their assets, and doing the same to their family and associates. So if you're the daughter of some rich Russian oligarch, you might be getting kicked out of the UK, kicked out of school, sent back to Russia, banned from having your assets frozen. Um, all in a way to put pressure on Putin and to put pressure on the Russian government not to stop the war. They've also stopped and restricted the sale of Russian oil, which has greatly harmed their economy. And Russia's been barred from international finance as well as anyone who deals with Russia. So obviously, it'd be very difficult to run a business if you don't have access to banks or loans or stock markets or trade with other countries, etc. Right? So we have, just a number of ways in which Russia has been harmed, their economy has been harmed, their government has been harmed, their ability to fight the war has been harmed by these sanctions, and it seems much more targeted and far less detrimental to the civilian populace in Russia than the ones that had been levied on Iraq in the 90s. So maybe sanctions have gotten better. I don't know. So let's just okay. So that's a bit of history. I think the history of sanctions has been kind of a history of failure. Maybe the first time we're seeing a success story is with Russia, where there's not large-scale death because of them, and maybe it's having a good effect. But I don't know. It's a complicated history. Let's talk about types of sanctions. So there's the sort of sanctions that we levied on Iraq and that you might think of as the most extreme form. So if all imports and exports are refused, then the sanctions are known as comprehensive sanctions, even if they have humane exceptions. So even if you have comprehensive sanctions against North Korea, you might have humane exceptions for COVID vaccine or certain medicines or some sort of food. That doesn't often go very well because many times the dictator will just sell that to a different country to get money. Doesn't actually give it to their populace, but it's not clear that once you put sanctions on a country, you can just let in a little bit of good stuff for the civilians and it actually get to them. It seems like the only way to actually get these medical supplies to the civilians is just to lift the sanctions entirely, because if you just make humane exceptions, those can just become sold by the ruler for his own benefit to somewhere else, or not provided to the citizens, or used as a way of exerting power over those civilians. I'll withhold this stuff from areas of the country that are being rebellious, so you don't get your portion of the international aid. Okay, another thing, sanctions can be multilateral or unilateral. So multilateral would be all countries or some big block of countries, the US, Mexico, the UN, UK, we're all going to get together and sanction this country. Or unilateral. Unilateral sanctions almost do nothing, but that's when you just say, I, in particular, am not gonna, this one country, by myself, am going to opt out of dealing with that country. Exports and imports, but it's not a part of a comprehensive multilateral effort, which bans some country from the global market. Economic sanctions can be imposed on sub-state groups as well, right? So it doesn't have to just be a sanction on the country. It can also be on companies, organizations, or individuals like Al-Qaeda or ISIS, or there was a ban on trade in conflict diamonds, so diamonds coming out of parts of Africa where the diamonds were being sold and used, the money was being used to support warlords who were terrorizing those countries. And anyone who dealt with these, first off, the sale of these diamonds was banned, but also anyone who traded with them was banned from dealing with the US. They were also then, like if you were a German diamond dealer and you bought some conflict diamonds, well now You might be prosecuted, but you ought, at the very least, you're not going to be able to sell diamonds to the U.S. or have a business license, etc. Right? So anyone, it's not just that the country can't sell this, but anyone who deals with that country in that regard is also going to have problems. And then lastly, let's just talk about the idea of targeted or smart sanctions. And those are the ones I was talking about with Ukraine and Russia, where you pick particular individuals, particular officials, their children, their associates, business leaders, particular technologies, etc., and then you ban trade with about those in particular, right? So, and that's supposed to put pressure on these powerful leaders and titans of industry and people in that power network to try overthrowing the government or putting pressure on the government to stop doing whatever evil thing they're up to. Okay, so those are the types of sanctions. Let's talk about what are the philosophical questions with regard to international sanctions. We talked about the history. We've talked a little bit about distinctions between types of sanctions. But let's try to grapple with what philosophical issues sanctions give rise to. So one, and this isn't in the readings, but this is something that bothers me, is are sanctions terrorism? So terrorism, I mean, the readings do talk about this, but they don't bring up the word terrorism. The distinction between terrorism, so we make a distinction between, let's just talk about bombings, like a plane bombing a target. Strategic bombings versus terror bombings. So strategic bombings is, I see that there are 30 bad guys in this building, and I'm trying to kill them, to kill the 30 bad guys. And there's 2 civilians that are next to the complex, or maybe they're there as janitors or whatever. So if I bomb this building, I kill the 30 bad guys, but I also kill the 2 civilians. I don't want them to die. There's side effects. They're collateral damage. I don't want to kill them. I hope they're not there. I hope they survive. They're not a part of the plan. They don't accomplish whatever I'm trying to accomplish. I'm just trying to kill the 30 people. That's unintended. We call that strategic bombing. We think that that's legitimate. It's okay to have civilian casualties when you're not trying to, when they're unintended, when they're a side effect or a double effect. If you're familiar with, in philosophy, what's called the doctrine of double effect, when it's a side effect of a morally justified aim, like maybe killing 30 bad guys in war. Terror bombing works the other way. Suppose instead of trying to kill 30 bad guys and I just happen to see 2 civilians will die, I'm targeting the civilians. I'm going to kill all of these civilians, these 30 civilians, the civilian, like there's a town that has all of the families of the leaders of the military. I'm going to bomb that. Or I'm going to threaten to bomb that, or I'm going to bomb some of it and then threaten to bomb the rest of it. Either way, I'm killing civilians in order to get the military to quit. Right? Terrorists are killing, terror bombing, but also terrorists are targeting civilians to accomplish their goal. It's not a side effect. It's not collateral damage. It's not they're targeting the soldiers, the combatants, and they happen to kill some civilians. They're targeting the civilians, the non-combatants, to accomplish what they're trying to do. So here's the worry. Are sanctions a form of terrorism, right? Because if you're targeting the populace, you're harming the economy. You're depriving the populace of travel, right? You're banning them. You're banning their. In Russia right now, if you have a Russian passport, you're not going to be able to travel. Are you hurting the economy, depriving industry of, civilian industry of opportunities? Are you destroying people's lives, their ability to travel, etc., particularly in Iraq, in order to accomplish your political or wartime goals? Kind of sounds like terrorism. Kind of sounds like I want to make the civilian populace, or I want to make people who are non-combatants miserable in order so that they put pressure on the government or leaders or are pushed into overthrowing the leaders because things are so bad under that leader, right? Clearly things were terrible under Saddam, and you can imagine a lot of people wanting to overthrow him and blame him for why things are so terrible because we've put sanctions on that country, and the hope was that people would rise up and overthrow Saddam, or the people in power would stage a coup and get rid of him or whatever. But it does seem like you're targeting the non-combatant civilians with your sanctions. So that's a question, right? Are sanctions ruled out by the sort of prohibition against terrorism? And then here's a second question, which I'm going to spend a lot of time on, is the bar, the standard for justified sanctions, lower than the one needed for war, right? Is what's required for me to be able to justify invading and going to war with a country, sending my army to kill them, to fight a violent war, is that higher than just putting some sanctions on them? Or is it the same? I mean, intuitively, sanctions seem much weaker and a nice alternative to war and a much more peaceful alternative to war. But there's some reasons to think that it shouldn't be any less. But let's start by talking about what's the justifications for war. And then we'll talk about if the justifications for sanctions are any less. So in these discussions, a lot of times what's talked about is just war theory. And just war theory claims that in order for a war to be just, it has to be limited to at least two causes, right? There has to be two justifications that are legitimate to have a war. One is the self-defense, the defense of the state from an imminent military attack. Okay. And the second one is maybe some sort of humanitarian intervention in where a state is committing genocide against its own people. So a country that's not about to invade me, but they are genociding their Kurdish population, their Jewish population, their etc. population. So one sort of interesting thing to point out, just war theory, and this is sort of the way in which the Western world thinks about war and when war is justified, it excludes a lot of things that people used to go to war for. Economic or political gain. I'm just trying to win the election or win my people over, or I want that country because it'd be good land for my country to have. Religious reasons, that's my holy land, I should have it. I mean, think about the U.S. expanding west. Manifest destiny. The U.S. is just destined to have all of the Western United States all the way to California. Why? What the fuck are you talking about? Anyway, right? Like, that's not are you in imminent danger of being attacked by the western part of the U.S.? Are you doing a humanitarian intervention? No, right? So these would be unjust, and also retribution, right? Getting vengeance on another country. So just war theory would rule out a lot of wars that in history have been justified in ways that don't just appeal to self-defense or humanitarian intervention to stop things like a genocide or slavery, etc. There's some important further restrictions on what counts as a just war. Proportionality. So in order to stop the genocide of 1 million people in some country, I can't start nuclear war that destroys all of us. Even if he's a terrible dictator, Saddam, I mean, he was, and he killed many thousands of people, but you might say, well, the number of deaths and chaos that resulted from trying to overthrow him is not proportional to the bad that you were trying to prevent. So the idea here is that even if the war was in self-defense, or even if the war was for humanitarian reasons, it's not just if what results is a war that is disproportionately terrible and far worse than whatever you were trying to prevent. Also, you have to have the right intention, right? You have to have the intention of the reason you're going to war needs to be self-defense, or the humanitarian reasons. You need to have legitimate authority. I don't know how I feel about this, but the idea here would be that even if you are just, even if you're right, you can't just go off on your own Sometimes, if I'm like, this is wrong, I'm going to stop this, and everyone around, the idea would be something like, if the UN doesn't agree, if the world community doesn't agree, maybe they're wrong, but you don't get to insert your judgment, even if you're the correct one, turns out. You need to make sure that you can convince other people. You can get the sort of authority. I'm not sure what authority here means. Maybe it's sort of UN agreement, maybe it's NATO agreement, maybe it's sort of world consensus or something like that. It's very nebulous what this means, but the idea here is just to sort of to say something like, you might be in the right because of self-defense or humanitarian reasons, but you shouldn't take it on yourself to be the one who gets to be the judge of this alone. So that's the legitimate authority requirement. Last resort, if there's a lesser requirement than war, you should take that instead of war. Reasonable chance of success, you shouldn't start a war that you're almost likely to lose and is just going to kill a lot of people in the process of you losing. That seems really reasonable to me. So many revolutionaries, so many rebellions are totally fated to lose, and yet they get started anyway, and they just end up getting, 100, 200, 1,000 people killed, and then they just peter out. And I think that sometimes they were justified, and they were totally correct to try starting them in some sense. That I think that if they could have succeeded, that would have been a great thing. But all you ended up doing was getting a bunch of innocent people killed and collateral damage, and maybe some policemen and soldiers who were just doing their job, etc. Right? So a war that you're doomed to fail is not just. It's not just doomed to fail and stupid because it's going to fail. It's also immoral because it's going to fail and not accomplish whatever was justifying you to do it, and get a lot of people killed in the meantime. And then lastly, discrimination. And this is just that a war should distinguish between the civilians who are just trying to get by and live their own life underneath a government, and the combatants, the people who are you need to kill in order to, and who are fighting you in order to overthrow the government or defend yourself or stop the genocide, etc. So great. What do we say about with sanctions with regards to this? I think sanctions can be if we just treat sanctions just like war, and sanctions are justified just like war are justified, then means you can level sanctions when there's an actual or imminent military attack and you need to sanction the other country in order to stop them, or for humanitarian reasons, to stop some sort of genocide or oppression or slavery. And then you also have to make sure that the sanctions are proportional. It seems like Iraq in the 90s was not proportional. You have to have the right intention. You can't be doing sanctions just because it benefits your country economically to have that country taken out of the world markets. Legitimate authority, in some sense that takes care of itself with sanctions, because you need unilateral sanctions for them to work. It doesn't work if you just do it yourself, so you need everyone's agreement. War, on the other hand, the US can go to war all by itself and not care about anyone else agreeing to it, but when the US is trying to levy sanctions, we need everybody on board, otherwise the country we're targeting will just trade with other countries. Last resort, sanctions seem like a better resort than war. Reasonable chance of success. It's a question whether sanctions have ever been successful. And discrimination. Here is where the terrorism worry comes up, right? That sanctions are an indiscriminate way of prosecuting or pursuing political goals, prosecuting a war, pursuing political goals, because you're not distinguishing between the civilians and the combatants. Do targeted, smart sanctions get around this? It's not clear that they're actually effective. It's not clear that how targeted they are. It's not clear whether we'll continue using them. I don't know. But that maybe solves that problem. Maybe that's just a problem for comprehensive sanctions. So let's talk about some worries about just war theory. one worry about just war theory is that I think a lot of just war theory comes out of after World War II. And you notice that just war theory doesn't allow you just to invade other countries to fix your borders. Say, like, well, our country should be this distance, or we can't defend our country unless we have further borders, or our country's not self-sufficient unless we have the farmland from our country next to us, or that country is just a product of colonial border drawing and really should be a part of us. So there's like a lot of different things that you might want to go to war for that just war theory doesn't allow, but it's put in place at a time where the borders of all these countries is kind of to the advantage of the Western world. So this idea that you can only go to war in self-defense or for humane reasons kind of freezes in place this post-World War II borders and structure, which was to the disadvantage of China, and after 1989 to the disadvantage of Russia. So there's a little bit of a worry here that just war theory is kind of a confabulated way of keeping in place the structure that benefits the Western world, just like the way in which we villainize chemical weapons. The Nixon administration had a decision to make about whether the U.S. had chemical weapons and nuclear weapons, and there was a decision to decide to say, well, we'll keep our nuclear weapons in the U.S., we'll get rid of chemical weapons, and we'll start a campaign that chemical weapons are somehow specially evil and no country should ever use them. Why? Well, because they're much easier to make than nuclear weapons, and so it's much easier to keep the club of nuclear powers smaller, and it was to the advantage of the U.S. and other nuclear powers to cut off some sort of weapon that smaller powers could use and demonize it in the way that we did chemical weapons. I mean, chemical weapons are terrible, but why are they worse than a bomb? Another worry about just war theory is that you could always just sort of squeeze a war into the justification, even if it doesn't quite fit it. I mean, it's not George W. Bush invaded Iraq in 2003 by claiming that Iraq was developing weapons of mass destruction, and that Iraq wasn't imminently going to attack the U.S., but if Iraq got chemical or biological or nuclear weapons, they would give them to terrorists, and somewhere down the line, that might lead to another terrorist attack on the U.S., just like September 11th. So out of self-defense, as just war theory requires, the U.S. needs to invade Iraq and overthrow Saddam. So we appealed to just war theory, but it doesn't seem like it fits it. But also, like, it's not clear that it seems like you can try to justify things using these criteria, and that having these criteria don't necessarily help all that much. Maybe they do. Actually, I do think they help, but that's a worry. Anyway, maybe they don't. Lastly, war traditionally has always involved conscripts. So going to war meant forcing your citizens unwillingly to join the army and throwing them to their deaths, and the other country doing the same. It's not clear that we should think about war in this way anymore. I mean, or at least that there's something different, where we have volunteer armies, contractors, air wars, which don't have conscripts, or sanctions, which don't have conscripts. It's not clear that just war theory, I mean, this is not a criticism of just war theory. I mean, it's a little bit of a question about it. It's just that, is war the same thing when we're not talking about forced participation? And maybe that means that just war theory doesn't apply to sanctions. So when we're talking about sanctions being different from war, because you're not conscripting, drafting your citizens to go fight and die, and the other side is also not conscripting and drafting people to go and fight you, that the rules for just war aren't applicable. And in fact, there are philosophers who've argued that the idea that we need, the sort of obvious thing you should do is say, well, sanctions are justified just when war is justified, so let's look at just war theory and we'll say sanctions are justified when war is justified. But the other way to think about it is like, no, 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 sanctions are something far less than war. So the bar for justifying sanctions is far less than, I mean, just war theory is covering when we can send an invading army to go kill people, maybe with conscripts against other conscripts. But like sanctions are this much more peaceful, humane, just economic policy. Why? Like we don't have to meet the high bar of when war is justified to decide when sanctions are justified. So here's a quote from Christensen and Powers, right? There is no reason why the principles governing war, including the power of discrimination, the one that rules out terrorism, should also govern economic sanctions. The rules are just different for sanctions and far lesser. Of course, this still leaves the question of what principles should govern economic sanctions, but the idea here would be it's wrong to look at the rules for when a war is justified to decide when sanctions are justified. And then we have to come up with the rules for when sanctions are justified, which presumably would be lesser. One proposal is to think about when economic sanctions are permitted as a tool of policing, international law policing instead of international war. I don't know exactly what that means. Clearly, the rules for raiding and arresting someone in their house as a police action are much weaker than when I can attack a foreign country and start a war to arrest and kill someone. But I'm not sure why policing should be applicable here. Policing seems very internal to a country. Also, policing is targeting and arresting the criminal, whereas war and sanctions involve a bunch of civilians and unaffiliated people in the country. So I'm not sure that that's a good model, but that's one possibility. Christensen and Powers, they provide this sort of proposal as long as the survival of the population is not put at risk and its health is not severely impaired. Aspects of daily life might temporarily be degraded for the sake of restoring the more basic rights of others. So if I can put sanctions on Iraq in order to restore the rights of the Kurds in Iraq and stop Saddam or the Shias from Saddam mistreating them, killing them, massacring them, then I can put sanctions on the populace of Iraq. I mean, it's not clear to me that this justification couldn't also be used for war. But that's another possibility, a weaker standard for sanctions. Here's where I really get a little worried, though. Christensen and Powers go on to argue that there are two further differences between war and economic sanctions that also lend support to abolishing the principle of discrimination, the idea that you can't target civilians, the sort of worry about sanctions being terrorism. They argue that a population might consent to suffer economic sanctions, in which case harming them would not violate their rights. I don't know what it means to get them to consent. I'm sure some of them wouldn't consent. And also, a lot of the population will consent to you invading. The Kurds and the Shias might consent to us invading Iraq to overthrow Saddam. Even, there's always a populace who's supportive inside the country of your invasion. So I'm not sure what it is to say the populace. Worry about their first justification. And then the second part is that a population can, in fact, bear moral responsibility for the actions of its government, for example, by supporting or not opposing them, and so not qualify as non-combatant or innocent. This, I think, is batshit crazy, and would justify us just killing any civilian in a country. The idea, also, if you've ever been to an oppressive country, those people do not support their government. They don't think they have any control. There's nothing they can do. They don't like the fact that they have the government they do. The idea that there's not a distinction between those people who are just as much victims of that government as anyone else, and the government themselves and the people fighting for the government. This just strikes me as disgusting and terrible. All right. So let's end with some philosophical questions. So I started with, are sanctions terrorism? And this has to do with that discrimination criteria in the just war theory that you need to be able to distinguish between, warfare that's targeting civilians, non-combatants versus the combatants, and maybe sanctions target the non-combatants and therefore are unjustified, maybe if something similar to terrorism. And secondly, is the bar for sanctions, legitimate moral sanctions, lower than the one needed for war? Are they the same? Can I have sanctions just when I can have wars? And I could have done either, and I did sanctions because they're easier and they cost me less? Or are sanctions this more humane economic policing activity or something that's less? So I can levy sanctions when it wouldn't be justified to go to war, when the problem hasn't arisen to the level that's justified by just war theory. So, one thing that I haven't talked about here is that maybe the justification for sanctions is lower because simply sanctions are just the refusal to engage with a targeted country and anyone who works with the targeted country. And then saying anybody who lives in my country and deals in my country who deals with them, we're going to arrest you because we can pass a law that we can arrest you for that, just like we can pass a law if you speed, we could arrest you. So maybe it's just keeping your hands clean and saying, sanctions have a lower bar than with war. I'm killing people and trying to overthrow a government. And with sanctions, I'm just trying not to be involved and not to support and not to be complicit in what that government is doing. So maybe that's a reason for thinking that the bar for sanctions are lower. One worry to have here is maybe sanctions are illegitimate, though, still, even in that case, because it's coercive, right? If I use my power as the United States to get every country to not trade with you and to arrest any of their citizens who trade with you, and you're a small country, it seems like, okay, in some sense, I'm keeping my hands clean and I'm just not being involved. On the other hand, I'm using my strength and my size to coerce you. It's like a millionaire a billionaire. How about a billionaire going on the street to a homeless person and saying, "I'll give you $100,000 to give me a blowjob," right? He's offering them money. He's giving them a choice. Maybe they take it, but it's coercive, right? They're using their power in an unfair way to put somebody in an impossible position. So maybe sanctions are like that, even if it is sort of a keep your hands clean kind of, I'm just not going to engage. But there's a way in which when it's not just a unilateral, I'm Sweden and I'm just not going to be involved and I'm not going to trade with you, but I'm the US and I say, well, I run the world banking system and no one gets to work with this country, and anybody who works with this country I won't work with, and anybody who works with them can't come to the US or we'll arrest you, and any country that doesn't do the same thing as we're doing, we're not going to trade with you either. There's a way in which you're sort of using your power to forcibly get everyone to gang up in a way that kind of seems similar to this sort of coercive behavior that billionaires can engage in with individuals, right? And lastly, here's another worry, is that does the availability of sanctions lead to more death and the powerful coercing the weak, powerful countries coercing the weak countries in a less costly way than that only merely seems more humane, right? If sanctions lead to hundreds of thousands of civilian deaths, but then in the US, there's no soldiers dying, there's no troops marching across the border. PR-wise, politically-wise, death-wise, costly-wise, it's very cheap to impose sanctions, comparatively, right? You can impose sanctions on Haiti and hope that it overthrows the government, and that puts a huge burden on the populace of Haiti and a huge strain on the government and the economy of Haiti, but U.S. citizens might not ever hear about it. No U.S. citizens die, there's no invasion, it doesn't really harm the U.S. public image except for in Haiti, right? So there's a worry here that then sanctions become really quickly used, right? It's like, oh, it's like war is messy. Like our populace will riot. People don't want to be a part of the it'll be costly. It'll be difficult. We'll take deaths. It's a huge political hit. It will draw worldwide attention and condemnation if we invade this country to do this thing. But if it's just sanctions, no one pays attention. I mean, it might. The worry about one worry about sanctions is that they'll be used more liberally and more easily for unjustified reasons because of the sense that the justification should be lower. Maybe it should be, but the worry is they'll be used in an incredibly low bar for very illegitimate reasons because it's so easy. And maybe governments are quick to use it because now this new tool that they can use after the collapse of the Soviet Union to accomplish economic and political, international goals without all of the messy terribleness and costliness of war, not for the sake of the populace that you're sanctioning, but for your own sake. Let me just end on a personal note. Why is this happening in this course? Well, I happen to know your professor, Ida, and I happen to know why she wants to include this. Well, I'm sorry, guys, but Ida didn't want me to tell that story, so I'm re-recording the end here. But if you want to hear it, find me in the philosophy department, wandering the halls, and I'm happy to tell you it in person. But so let's end with just one final point about sanctions, which is a worry that a lot of times the people who are the target of these targeted sanctions, the Russian oligarchs, their family members, their associates, their business partners, when they're in the U.S., they hire high-powered lawyers and lobbyists to try to get them to be granted an exception to the sanctions that they've been targeted by. They do things like point out that they employ 50 Americans at their company, or have some sort of positive effect on the U.S. economy or employment, and that these sanctions harm them and thereby harm the U.S. or harm these Americans who are their employees. Sometimes the lawsuits are on behalf of the employees who are being harmed by the sanctions put on their boss or the owner of their company, etc. This seems terrible. That if we're going to do sanctions and we want them to have the intended effect, the idea that with the right lawyers you can get some sort of exception through the courts on your behalf, undermines the purpose and point and efficacy of targeted sanctions. I met one of the lawyers in DC who does this sort of work, and he was just the most miserable human being you've ever met in your life. I mean, in some sense, he was just some dumb kid who just graduated law school and got his first high-paid, prestigious job out of law school, and he was really proud of himself, describing how he does this terrible work trying to get people out of the sanctions that target them. And he's saying things like, well, you got to understand, when it comes to sanctions, there's no morality about it. It's just, trying to get the best business deal you can. It's like, well, no. The whole point of sanctions, the reason for the sanctions is a moral, is the product of concern for morality. It's a concern for you're placing the sanctions on the company or the country to try getting, in this case, Russia, to stop invading its neighbors and killing Ukrainians and prosecuting the war the way that they are. And you're using sanctions instead of invasions because you're trying to do it in a more humane way. The only person who doesn't care about morality is you, lawyer guy, who's trying to get his clients out from under the thumb of these targeted sanctions. But if you have enough money, there's always someone who will do bad things for you and help you do bad things. But I don't know what to say about this. It's just another wrinkle on trying to understand sanctions and their effect and their efficacy and their role the fact that when you have these sorts of targeted sanctions, these rich oligarchs, businessmen, often have ways to try finagling through the legal system, getting out from underneath them. And in particular, the claims that they make are things like, I employ X number of Americans and contribute this much to the American economy. If you hold me to these sanctions, I have to shut down or sell my company or fire everybody. So for their sake, I care about these Americans I employ. I don't want them to have to go jobless. So please excuse me from these sanctions that you've placed me under. But I don't know what to say about that. But other than I'm horrified by people trying to help these people get out from underneath them. That's not to say that sanctions are good or the right answer. As you can tell from this lecture, I am very skeptical of whether sanctions work, whether they're more moral than war, whether they do more harm than good. I don't know. I think sanctions are young in our tool set to try shaping the world, and maybe they'll turn out to be a great powerful moral tool, an alternative to war. But at least the current history seems to be a history of failure and death wrought by well-meaning sanctions that were idealistically hoped to be a more humane alternative to violent war and invasion. But in any case, if you want to take Philosophy 100 with me, I'll be teaching it in the spring. Andrew Fife. You guys take care.